Anything more to say before that? We're going to open up for a round of questions. I mean, there are a number of very specific recommendations about sort of moving, as Dan and Simon and other members of the Council have called it, the business model for humanitarian assistance. I think it's very important that much of the work here is focusing on the disaster prevention preparedness end of the spectrum. I suppose a question that comes into my mind is, do we have any sense of what a fit-for-purpose disaster prevention preparedness system might look like for a low-income country that is struggling on so many fronts in terms of growth and development? Maybe we can come back to that. Let me take a few questions, cluster them hopefully, and then get Simon and Dan to react. We need to talk into microphones because this is being streamed on the internet. Just there, Liam, please. You say who you are.
I'm Daniel Nelson. I'm a journalist. Can I take it by your lack of a reference to it that you think the UN work on disaster preparedness has been rather a waste of time, or has been very ineffective?
Any more? Samir, down here. Why don't you go straight at the back and then down to Samir?
I'm Zbigniew Mikolayuk from Practical Action. I like this presentation about the building local capacity. One of the issues, and I'm talking from my experience in Hindu Kush in Himalaya, is the capacity building in a sense of bringing relevant knowledge to people. Have you estimated how much it would cost to ensure that the communities, that the people, including illiterate, will get the knowledge they need in facing the natural disasters? We've done some kind of the analysis in the Hindu Kush Himalaya. We called it the knowledge gaps. And we've done analysis in northwest Pakistan and North India, where we are looking what people know in relation to natural disasters and risk, what they should know, and how can we fill the gaps. I would be interested if there is any estimation how much it would cost, because this will not happen by divine intervention. It has a very hard work, particularly to reaching people who are usually not reached with the what I call knowledge services.
Okay, very good, thanks. And then Samir in the front.
Samir Hawaii from the ODI. I guess, one of the issues that you mentioned was the fact that the caseload for humanitarian assistance is increasing, and hence the need for a business model. But if you look at where the majority of the humanitarian caseload lies, and where most humanitarian spends are in the type of protracted crises that are year on year, such as DRC or Somalia or Afghanistan. And I guess if you are going to kind of get the business model within those types of contexts, it seems I'm just struggling to see how that might work in practice, because from my experience of working with the private sector, kind of issues of peace building, and also in humanitarian assistance, it seems to me that they're really only going to be fully engaged when it makes business sense to them. So I know you mentioned the fact that it might not just be kind of motivated by profit, there might be a humanitarian imperative. But I think if it's going to be sustainable engagement, it has to actually make business sense. And then I'm just kind of struggling to see then how this type of models would work in those type of kind of protracted conflicts or crises, where I can't really see the business sense that it would make for the private sector to get engaged.
Okay, very good. And then just at the back there.
I'm Maurice Herson from, where do I say I'm from? I suppose I'm from the Refugee Studies Centre nowadays. A couple of points. One is, this is obviously working, this discussion, because it's making me think, so I'm kind of thinking out loud a bit at the moment. One of the problems has always, with humanitarian assistance, has always been that we've been accused of being too narrowly focused on, the needs of that person or that group of people who have a particular need, whether it's for shelter or food or whatever, rather than taking the bigger context. And there are many arguments on both sides about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's been one of the focuses. I suppose one of the, reflecting on Haiti, the analysis that we've been given, despite appearing to be quite, big, misses out the most important factors, which are the geopolitical factors, if you like. Crudely, the behaviour of the United States in relation to Haiti in the last century is a big part of the problem. And if you're not taking that into account, then you're not dealing with what's happening in Haiti, either now or in the next phase of its potential resilience and recovery and so on. And can I make one other short point as well, which is I worry with the tripartite involvement model, while it looks good, if you approach hard-headed business people and convince them that it's the right model, and then show them a situation in which local government, either at the local level or at the national level, and local capacity, either at the community level or at the NGO level, is very weak, are they not going to say, well, nice model, but we haven't got the other bits to work with, so we're not going to do anything?
Okay, very good. Why don't we take some of those? Simon, do you want to have a go at a few of those and then pass on to Dan?
Just quickly, Daniel, on the is this on?
Yeah.
On the UN efforts, we kept coming back to the role of the ISDR Secretariat in Geneva, which is the kind of the post-Hyogo implementation mechanism, and we discovered that Sir John Holmes is responsible for it within the UN, and he was very strongly encouraging of these new things we were doing. So I think that the answer is that all hands to the pump, because although there is a momentum after Hyogo, there isn't enough actually happening on the ground. And so we would want to engage with ISDR but not rely on it, or at least to integrate what we do within it. I think, let me say something about business and leave some of the geopolitics to Dan. You said I would leave you the difficult questions.
See how this working relationship has developed.
See how productive it is. I should have said, by the way, that it was Dan's organisation, International Alert, that published the document. Did we bring some copies? And are they on the table?
Yeah,
They're on the table.
But they're also available online. It's a very interesting question about business and development generally and humanitarian aid in particular. And it is, of course, one starting point to say that the only reason business engages in anything that looks philanthropic is because they can see a long-term profit in it. I actually don't buy that from the experience of working both on ODI's business and development programme and in watching people engage on this humanitarian agenda, and particularly Haiti. I mean, let me just think aloud about what the business and development programme work at ODI has taught me anyway, and I'm probably out of date on it. But when I was thinking about it, I identified a 4-step ladder. And the first step is that companies engage in philanthropic activity. They raise money for the orphanage, or they collect money for, Haiti. The second step is that they sign the UN Compact and stop using slave labour and allow free association of trade unions. The third level is that they review their supply chains and start buying from small businesses or producing products more suited to bottom of the pyramid consumers. And the fourth step on the ladder is that they begin to engage in global public policy activity, like, for example, where does the next generation of biofuels come from? Now, what are businesses doing when they mobilise to work in emergencies? I suppose what they're mostly doing is working on the first step of the ladder in the philanthropic space. And why do businesses do that? Well, they do it partly because they're not all bad people. Indeed, some of them are quite good people, and they like to be able to help. But they also, in general, engage in philanthropic activity because it's very good for employee relations. And something that chief executives often say to you is that when young graduates are joining the organisation or thinking of joining the organisation, the question they will ask is, well, what are you doing in terms of fair trade and corporate social responsibility? Because people want to work for companies that are not, on the whole, making landmines or, destroying the rainforest. Very often companies also say that being engaged in the development activities that they are is also very good for their license to operate. It buys them, it enables them to have much better relationships with the communities where they're working. And you're less likely to be firebombed if you take your health services outside the fence and work in other ways on community development. Now, in the particular case of the humanitarian disasters and the work of the World Economic Forum on those, I would say an awful lot of it is simply wanting to help, because people are affected by what they see on the television screen. So people will provide medicines. You know, you need to vaccinate people, if you do, which is debatable, I know, in Aceh against cholera after the tsunami. Well, we've got cholera vaccine. Here it is. Take it. And that is philanthropic. In the case of these logistics companies, which, as I say, is the most advanced of the partnerships that the Forum has established, these are companies who see that they have real skills in managing large-scale distribution and managing airports and communications and so on, and want to put them at the service of the international community, and are offering it on a pro bono basis. Now, you know, does it have a very long-term business payoff for them? I would say it's pretty indirect and pretty long-term. But the fact that you've got companies that are working together, so TNT and Agility and UPS, combining their forces, trading together, studying the principles that I showed you together so that they are ready for an emergency, I think indicates that there's something much more going on than simple profit maximisation.
Simon, can I come back to you? Because I think one of the points that Samir is making is that it's not just what's the long-term sort of business payoff. It's also, our business going to come back and back and back again in a protracted crisis context. They may be very willing to dole out vaccines for a short-term response, but are they going to come back year after year to unfolding crises in the same location?
I mean, we certainly know, and we've said, and we've drawn on ODI work on business and humanitarian programs to say this, that there are popular emergencies and there are unpopular emergencies, and people, you know, reacted tremendously positively to the tsunami, and you don't see quite so many logistics companies offering to go and work in Mogadishu. I mean, that's absolutely the case. But I think we then need to come back to some of the issues that Dan was talking about, which, and in a way that Maurice was raising, which are that a lot of these protracted emergencies, there are different entry points where there may be different things that governments can do. I mean, I don't know, Southern Sudan is no longer in the same category as Somalia, say, but there are a lot of big companies now looking at Southern Sudan and beginning to work, and what we need to do is to encourage them to work in such a way that they are doing the other things on the ladder, which are then building a much stronger development framework. So do I think that having business engaged in disaster prevention and preparedness is going to be the answer to the problems of DRC? No, I don't. And I think we're realistic about that. But do I think that we could go quite a long way if we encourage them to do more in the places where they could do more? Then I think the answer to that is yes. And this fascinating question about knowledge gaps, I imagine Practical Action have calculated the costs, so they're going to tell us what the answer is. So please do, and I'll leave the rest of the questions to them.
Yeah. Just on the knowledge gaps thing, we certainly haven't done anything that adds up to being a calculation of how much it would cost. There's a kind of mantra which is sung at the moment in International Alert, which is based on the title of a report that we produced about World Bank financing for development. We said the issue is how, not how much. And I do think, of course, how much is always an issue. But very often, for example, in climate change issues, talking about mitigation or talking about adaptation, all the focus goes on to the money. And much too little of the focus goes on to the nature of the activity, what is done and how it's done. And I think that one of the very important parts of that is to emphasize again the importance of the local level. It's not going to be how well is information transmitted from, I don't know, Manila to Mindanao, or from Islamabad into Kashmir, or from Delhi into Indian parts of Kashmir. It's going to be how is information being handled and generated and understood there? What are the mechanisms that people have? What are the media which they have? And what degree of control do they have over them? Because in general, controlled media is trusted media. Media which you participate in is more highly trusted. On the business engagement thing, one of the things that I was going to say is that when it comes to sustainable engagement in difficult environments, and there's a spectrum of how difficult the environments are, I agree that there's a difference between a sustained engagement and a sort of a one-off, you know, while it's making headlines, business may have one kind of motivation. When it's not making headlines, tax breaks for a sustained engagement for working in disaster prevention and so on may be one of the best things that could be done. And that, I think, is not going to be enough of an incentive to get over the disincentives that some of the extreme environments impose, but it could encourage some companies a little bit further along the road of difficulty. And I think also the second point that Maurice made about hard-headed business leaders who don't see all the component parts of the model being there. You know, many hard-headed people see that not all of the component parts of the model are there. And I think one of the myths about the private sector, which I would like to dispel, I certainly go along with all Simon's nice dispelling of the nasty myths about the private sector. But honestly, if you think that dealing with the private sector is dealing with a bunch of people who have quick, efficient meetings, are consistent in the positions that they take, are efficient in their, forget it. I mean, come back to the NGO sector where we really know how to do things efficiently. Our private sector engagements are a nightmare of going around in circles because of them, not because of us. So I think everybody has that sort of, you know, that wanting to be in a position where you can do the things, and skepticism about being made, that all the components are there. And in some places, the components are so visibly not there that it is definitely worth turning your attentions to somewhere that will give you more return. But there are places which are difficult environments, but where the components are there. But what are those components made up of? They're generally made up of people or networks or organizations. Sometimes they're latent or nascent, but sometimes they're real and active. And to me, it's the sort of paying close attention to the granular reality of those places and those people, those communities, gives source for a lot more hope that action can be undertaken. And then you come to the kind of the big picture question, you know, how the world is moving and where it has come from, and the history of, for example, US relations with Haiti, or indeed French relations with Haiti. You know, we can trace it all right back. And a lot of Latin America, I mean, Colombia, I remember doing a sort of one of the first things I ever did was a kind of reverse conflict mapping of Colombia, and each conflict was clearly caused by the unfinished business from the previous conflict. And there are places just with this kind of, this burden of history sitting upon them. And the saddest thing, and the most, from the point of view of, so being very businesslike about the business model, the obstacle that gets in the way is where that history is alive, and it's still living, and it's still being repeated, and it still goes on, which is also the case between US and Haiti. And I think it's absolutely true that Haiti does not have a sustainable development prospect in front of it, while its relations with the US are as they have been. And despite everything, I do not believe that this horrible disaster will revolutionize US relations and policy towards Haiti. Nonetheless, I think that there are things within those limitations that can be done in Haiti, which would mean there was more resilience there, and that vulnerability had been narrowed compared to what has been seen in the recent years. And I think that that's to do with understanding that the big problem maybe is not going to be resolved, but there are nonetheless identifiable, concrete, specific things which can be done and can be tackled, and which do improve the condition of people, but don't answer finally or resolve finally the development dilemmas of a country like Haiti.
Very good. Simon, you wanted to quickly come back in?
Two quick things, actually. One is that there was a very interesting discussion in Davos about lots of aspects of Haiti, but one in particular I wanted to refer to here, which is that this has been one of the first really major urban disasters. I mean, I can think of others like Managua, for example, but anyway, a very big urban disaster. And there were some very unprecedented problems for the humanitarian relief agencies, one of which is that there was no fuel and not much water. And so the typical humanitarian relief response of distributing food to people in the form of dry rations that they could then cook actually wouldn't work. And so a worldwide search had to be launched to find meals ready to eat, as they say. I mean, compo rations we used to have when I was at school. you know, there's a factory in Mexico that produces high-density cereal bars. Could it scale up quickly in order to make sure people had stuff in Haiti? Now, this was much discussed, and a number of businesses led by Unilever then get together to say, we need a kind of global response to this problem. We need a database of what kinds of foods would be acceptable and relatively easy to manufacture in different places, coconut based in one place, you know, cassava based in another place. And this is an example, I think, of the businesses operating on the fourth step of my ladder, where they're trying to solve this global public policy problem that there are no easily available high-density foods available for urban disasters. I wanted to say one other thing, which was triggered by a couple of things people said, which is that one of the issues I've struggled with a lot is to understand what is the humanitarian caseload. Never mind what it's going to be in the future, but what is it today? And if you ask the humanitarian agencies, what you get are the people they're helping. You cited a figure of 90 million people receiving food aid. Well, of course, those are the failures in the sense that all the other, Madeira, nobody's, WFP, at least they probably are, but let's hope they're not, are not rushing ships of emergency food aid to Madeira, you know, because it's happening in a developed country. In China, as I said, there was very little external response. So I spent some time before I left ODI asking the question, what is the humanitarian caseload? And even the world's greatest experts, those in ODI, couldn't give me the answer to that because actually there is no global estimate of the people affected by all these different kinds of disasters. But the point that we came to in the discussions we had was that these difficult political cases, the protracted emergencies, which loom very large in the world of those of us sitting in the north trying to help in the south, A, are already probably not the biggest part of the caseload, and B, certainly won't be in the future when it's the Manilas and the Jakartas that bear the brunt of the new climate-related and poverty-related and population density-related emergencies. So I think we have a big challenge as a humanitarian community actually to get a much better picture of what is out there and all the different things that need to be done in order to support people.
Great. I'm going to go for a quick another round of questions, but take this one on board because we got one via the internet, which is from Valerie Leach, who's a researcher with RAPOA based in Tanzania. Could you say something about situations such as Somalia or Darfur? If this business model is not applicable, and I think she's picking up on something you said about whether or not those situations have moved on or it's not the appropriate sort of context for this kind of thinking, what model might there be that's more appropriate? Take that on board as one of the questions. I have questions over there and then come back to the middle. Wait for the microphone, please, so people listening on the web can hear you.
Hi, I'm Jack Campbell from DFID, and thank you for this report. I find it really usefully practically orientated, which is not always the case with these reports. I just had a couple of questions. On private sector engagement, you haven't mentioned the insurance industry as far as I'm aware, and obviously that's the insurance industry is in the business of risk. So I just wondered if you could reflect a little on opportunities there and challenges. And secondly, in terms of the UN system and the international system, you mentioned ISDR, Simon, but obviously there's mainstream agencies that have responsibilities in the context of building national capacities, UNDP, OCHA, to name but a few, and obviously World Bank and regional development banks. I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on how we can better support national and local capacity in kind of, you know, in the mechanisms that we have available to us at the moment and those that perhaps need to be established.
Okay, very good, thank you. Right in the middle here, Liam. Lady in black, and then
Raffaella Bellanca, head on Household Energy Network. I'm glad you touched the point on the food problem in Haiti, because I think it is a good example on how to move from a intervention situation in which the government is not strong enough to a different reality like the one of China. I had the opportunity to volunteer in Haiti, and some of the programs of the NGO I was working with were financed by the food program. And The problem was that the people working were paid with rice coming from abroad, which did put out of business the people producing rice in the country. And this is, I saw the same rice sacks now coming to Haiti for the relief program, and the earthquake wasn't in the countryside, so I guess the people I met and I knew are still out of business in the same situation. This wouldn't be the case in the China kind of emergency relief aid. So that's one of the problems.
Very good. Can you just pass it along?
Hello, it's Anusha Varmadeva of the United Nations Association in the UK. Firstly, I'm sorry, Dan, but I would totally disagree with you about the private, what you said about the private sector, because I've been, and going back to what that gentleman said from DFID, I've been in corporate insurance in the private sector for 20 years now. And I started looking at the whole humanitarian and international development sector about 5 years ago, I suppose, primarily because I'm from Sri Lanka originally, and so it's very close to my heart. And, you know, again, frankly, I've been appalled and horrified at the silo mentality that's existed in this sector. And going back to, you know, some of the names that, again, the gentleman mentioned from DFID about UN, you've got UNRWA, you've got OCHA, you've got ISDR, etc. Coming from the private sector, one of the things that we would always seek to do, well, this is certainly my experience from where I come from, is to consolidate various organizations. And, you know, going back to what Simon was saying about organization, information, connection, communication. And I was just, wondering if you could make a comment about how you see things going forward, in that what I see is there is a lot of rhetoric, I'm sorry to say. So what kind of actions are we putting into place for organization communication such that, you know, the likes of Haiti, when the likes of Haiti does happen again, God forbid, or the tsunami, there is better communication between all the organizations. I mean, what I see is, isn't the UN not, isn't the reason why there are so many NGOs and charities and whoever working in the humanitarian sector, because the UN is not functioning as it should be.
Okay. Want to start? Any more questions this round? Just one over here, Liam, and then we'll take responses. I mean, one of those phrases that's very big in the private sector, increasingly entering into development, of course, is interoperability. And it's a phrase that you didn't use, or a term you didn't use, but it's one that's growing and being used increasingly about the need to break out of silos.
It's just a point, going back to something you said at the beginning about the continuum with, say, Sichuan at one end and Haiti at the other. I think that's a really useful way of thinking about government's roles. But there are cases that don't fit so well. And you mentioned Pakistan's earthquake response somewhere in the middle, but you could flip that round and say the Pakistan response to the crisis caused by military action in the Swat Valley doesn't fit so well in the middle of that continuum. And what do we do in those sort of cases, for instance, like Sri Lanka, and how does that affect the model? And from that, if we accept that this new model is just going to be one and it's going to operate differently in different contexts, if we accept the importance of partnership, the importance of saying, if we're looking for this new business model, but what ways of working in partnership are already out there? Because I think faith-based NGOs, the Red Cross, have done things to work with governments, with local actors, and as themselves, which we can learn a lot from, and the private sector can learn a lot from, and not to build duplicate systems. And just a final note to say that on this, ALNAP's meeting in November is going to be looking at domestic and national regional capacities for disaster response, and anyone who's interested in finding out more about that should approach me afterwards.
Okay, very good.
And I want to come back to your fit for purpose question, which is, of course, a really big challenge. Cash, not food, is an absolutely central part of the whole response package. And in Pakistan, I think every family was given, somebody will know, was it $150 or something? Does anybody know what the answer is to that question? Every family was given cash in order to try and encourage the rebuilding of the economy. Paul Harvey's work at ODI on using cash rather than physical handouts. And ditto in Haiti, because there were markets operating within 50 miles of Port-au-Prince within hours of the earthquake, but people had no cash. Their cash had been buried in their houses, the banks weren't working, people were sending remittances to Haiti, but the banks had no cash, so couldn't distribute remittances to people. But a number of agencies have now started food for work programs, UNDP, for example, WFP using vouchers. So I think there's been a huge breakthrough, which I attribute very much to the work of Paul Harvey, actually, on raising the profile of this cash issue and the need to re-establish markets. Insurance, Haiti had a cat bond of some kind, or they were a member of, I think, of a regional insurance mechanism. And did they get $15 million? I mean, or $8 million. And the appeal issued this week was for well over $1 billion. And I suppose, you know, the question is, what kind of insurance premium would you have to pay if you wanted to provide anywhere close to $1 billion worth of insurance for Haiti? And I know that people like Swiss Re are working on cat bond insurance, and there are a number of places in the world where it's happening. Did DFID pay the premium? Somebody paid. The UN paid the premium for Ethiopia, I think, in case of famine. But needless to say, you know, disaster insurance can be very expensive unless you have a very big risk pool in which to lose it. The question is who's going to pay that. And that, of course, comes to Alison's question about being fit for purpose. Because you could imagine an absolutely gold-plated disaster prevention and preparedness set up in a country for something that might never happen, whereas children are dying every day, and so you have to get it right. Now, you know, as I think about that, I'm led to countries that I know about and where I've worked, where drought and famine are relatively predictable and regular, where obviously it makes enormous sense to invest heavily in climate forecasting, in early warning and response, in setting up social safety nets that can be on the shelf and rolled out really quickly, in stockpiling food and managing an emergency food reserve in a country. But I think it has to be case by case, where you look at the costs and the benefits. And one of the points that is in this book, which has a number of sets of principles, is very low probability but high impact catastrophes are worth planning for because simply the impact of the catastrophe is so high. Now, how do we solve all this, and how do we deal with the question that came in via the internet for very difficult places like Somalia? I think the whole approach, and this is really at the heart of our proposal, is it has to be case by case. I mean, you can imagine doing this, you know, in London, or in Manila or somewhere, or Jakarta, where you could realistically put together a public-private NGO partnership to do some very detailed planning. And you would have Dan's daughter who would be making the tea. And I don't have daughters, but I do have a son who works on social enterprise, which is about companies partnering with local institutions. So he could be there arranging local partnerships, and we'd be fine. You're not going to do that in southern Sudan immediately or in Somalia. But so what are the opportunities for business engagement, really, is the question that we want to try and focus on. And in those more difficult places, you can't do everything, but you can do something. And there are some big multinational investments going into countries largely because of natural resource extraction. So let's talk to them about what they can do. Let's make sure we have the registration numbers of their trucks. Let's talk to them about using their resources to manage the logistics and taking their services outside the fence. So I think not everything can be done everywhere, but something can be done everywhere.
Dan,
I think also in some places, including some of the most difficult ones, one could think that something like this tri-sector approach that I was talking about, that involves people from the authorities, people from the business sector, however that's defined and operating, and people from voluntary organizations, that still is the sort of the source of, if there is any, of a group that gets together, which, whether it is in Darfur or in other parts of Sudan or in Somalia or indeed in DRC, where I've seen that kind of thing with my own eyes, that actually is then able to make something function for the betterment of people, or for the preparation of response, or even for prevention of disaster. And very often the problem there, you were asking the question about, what's the best way for DFID to support it, for example. And very often in those circumstances, the best way is for DFID actually not to support, because those things, given the politics of the place, are only going to happen in the gaps. They're going to be things that fall through the cracks of local power and everything that is negative and constraining and defining and that's creating the problem. And in those cracks, it's sometimes surprising what people are able to do. But if any kind of torchlight is shone upon them, they lose the room for manoeuvre, because shade is part of what gives them their room for manoeuvre there. In terms of the UN and the coordination role with NGOs and so on, I mean, I think that if there were no coordination being attempted, what is bad would be even so much worse, and what is good would be so much harder to find. And you would immediately say, well, there should be an Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and it should take things over. The problem, I think, does not lie in the technical competence of in OCHA or in the other UN agencies or amongst the NGOs. I think it partly lies in the jungle of different agencies within the UN. But I think it more lies in political questions. And I think that a lot of the problems come back to political issues, sometimes large and meaty and long-term and hard-to-handle ones that come from the history of development of the country or of the conflicts that it has had with countries around, and sometimes from much, in a sense, nastier, shorter-term ones to do with the profile which a given politician insists on having on a certain issue which is in their country's backyard. And so I think politics is consistently, and it's not surprising, and in a way this shouldn't be seen as being a complaint, but politics is consistently getting in the way of the efficient response. And the question of Sri Lanka was raised. How would such a model function in Sri Lanka in March, April, May of last year, as the government offensive came to its height, as the government was systematically keeping out all NGOs, the UN, all reporters, all independent sources of information. The answer is the model wouldn't function in those circumstances. It just couldn't. I mean, how on earth could it possibly? But once the situation had settled to some degree, there is actually the basis in Sri Lanka, indeed in the government, in the state apparatus, indeed in amongst both national and international NGOs, though they have found it very hard to function, or we have found it very hard to function in Sri Lanka over the past several years, and in the private sector, both the international and the Sri Lankan private sector, to have formed such partnerships that would be able to undertake what would have been their disaster response. But the politics are always going to get in the way. And I think that one of the, maybe finishing point, one of the questions which we were asking ourselves and never really went into during the course of preparing this document and the later work was about the humanitarian space. By promoting an idea of a new business model, by wanting some of the principles to be linking the humanitarian action, disaster response, more to broader development questions, by wanting to rebalance spending between prevention, response, and recovery, were we doing something sort of bad, wrong, to the humanitarian space? Should the International Committee of the Red Cross, Red Crescent at this point be standing up and saying, hang on, let's not get into Colin Powell territory and so on? And I think the answer is that we came to is no, that in the changing world, with the humanitarian caseload rising, the way in which it is possible to support and defend the humanitarian space is actually by bringing this wider range of actors into it on a much more systematic basis.
That sounds a very appealing note. Any more questions before I... Yep, right at the front first, and then Maurice again.
Back there.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, I'm Nikki Black. I'm a research consultant on corporate citizenship and humanitarian action, currently working with the UN Global Compact on a few of their bits and pieces. My question is about how you see the organizational landscape changing to promote this agenda. You had ASEAN as your case study, and I was hoping you were going to go more into how you saw that playing out. Certainly with Cyclone Nargis, we saw the development of Ponja, and ASEAN moved into the humanitarian space in a way it's never been before. And I specifically am wondering, and they had the question about IRSD and moving this agenda within that, working with the UN. Certainly the Global Compact released the UN Business Portal, an online website, last month, and I've heard that they've been fielding a huge number of business responses to the earthquake in Haiti. Really, that quite overwhelmed them at the beginning and has been a key portal. So my questions are, how do you see, specifically within the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council, how this work will move forward, if it moves forward any further, how it might be pursued within the forum, and then what other global governance level organizational initiatives you might see being developed to manage the international, global, national, local response, which is so tricky in this sort of multi-stakeholder space. Thank you.
Thank you. Very quickly, Maurice. Keep it short because we're coming.
Yes, I'll make it short. Maybe I wasn't listening clearly enough earlier, but I was very interested to hear Dan talk about local businesses, because I wanted to say something about local businesses. A couple of experiences of my own from a long time ago. In 1992 in Mogadishu, the business of delivering food was impossible, as it continues to be now, I should imagine. And Fred Cuny's solution at the time in discussion was monetize it. Basically, give the food to local merchants. They can deal with it. They can deliver it. They can truck it. They can get it out there. Don't deliver the food. Give it to the local merchants to do it. So that was one thing. The other thing is even earlier than that, in Red Sea Hills in Sudan in the mid-80s, when the famine struck and people were desperate and needed to get out of the countryside to the roadside where they could be helped, it was the local merchants who sent their trucks into the nowhere and brought people to the roadside. Of course, you know, the knock-on effect was that those merchants then had a stake, if you like, in the humanitarian response and expected their rake-off and so on. They were the insurance policy, though. I worked for Oxfam at the time, and we had interesting discussions about whether they were entitled to their rake-off for having done what they did and what they would do the next time as well. So local businesses, in the very small local sense, are very important as well.
Okay, I'm sure you'd agree entirely with that. Right over in the corner over there. We've also had, while we're waiting for the mic to come across, a question which I think is probably too big to deal with at this point, but I'm going to raise it anyway. Based on Haiti, would you support a stronger right to protect approach by the UN in such situations and substitute national sovereignty? And that's from Espen in Norway.
I'm Xavier Lecacher. I used to be in DFID until last year. I had two questions about two types of actors, building on what Simon Maxwell was saying. Diaspora as they send remittances, but also, as we have seen in many crisis like in Pakistan 2 to 3 years ago, diasporas organizing themselves through their businesses here in the UK and trying to help practically in supporting the kind of recovery phase. And also social enterprises such as microfinance networks. I understand that, for instance, in Haiti, one of the most resilient kind of institutions has been Foncose and the 2 or 3 other microfinance networks, which probably a few days after the earthquake were able to build again on their branches and so on to start again to deliver monies, as you said, and small cash stipends. Thank you.
Very good. Okay. Dan, do you want to come back to you, Simon? Any or some of those?
The only thing which two things I'll comment on about that. One is Maurice's question about the importance of the local. One of the things which I learned in working in the Eastern Mediterranean and semi-Middle East countries, Southeast Europe, is not to underestimate those contexts where absolutely everything is political. So that, yes, it is very often the case, I think, that simply by essentially relying on and tapping into the local trade networks, you will find that distribution of food, for example, happens efficiently the way that market theory tells you it ought to. But there are also people who will, purely because of what they think is right and wrong, interrupt those networks very, very hard. Having said which, one of the areas where I worked where everything is political is the Western Balkans. And there, the most well-integrated, inter-ethnic organisation and interethnic dialogue and communication that happened at all happened between businessmen. It was just that they were the ones who were breaking the law. It was what was referred to at the time as the mafia, which had absolutely no barriers about selling it back and forth. But anyway, on R2P, I think that it's interesting to look at those cases where you can see that a humanitarian disaster is related to the failure of a government to fulfill what are part of the responsibilities of sovereignty that balance out the rights to sovereignty. But I think that those cases are relatively few and far between. And I think that to build a new humanitarian business model on the basis of the same kind of set of assumptions as in responsibility to protect, I think might start to lead them both astray. So that neither was responsibility to protect able to be sort of a framework that could be utilized when it needed to be in the conflict scenario, and on the other hand, the humanitarian space would become so heavily politicized that it would be also compromised. So I'll leave it there. Hard questions for Simon.
No, thank you. I think on where it goes from here.
Thanks for picking up R2P. You know, I think we have to be modest here. You know, we're a small group of people doing this kind of on a pro bono basis, glad to be asked to help the World Economic Forum, very aware that we don't have all the answers to all the problems and certainly don't have the capacity to deliver it. But the WEF, apart from its global perspective, does bring this particular comparative advantage of working with business. And having in the room, apart from all the people I listed, some of the big logistics and construction companies and health companies and so on, does give us a particular niche. Now, what we know is that coordination of humanitarian effort is getting better. I mean, people are quite enthusiastic about the cluster system and the way it's working in Haiti, which is about trying to avoid the overlap of all the different agencies. We think that the answer here is to try and encourage people to take it down to the local level and just do it. And it may be that it's already happening through ASEAN, you know, in regions of the Philippines or Indonesia or Vietnam or Thailand, in which case, and that businesses are involved and that there is a kind of multi-stakeholder initiative to improve disaster preparedness, in which case, great, let's get it written up, and it provides a model. I'm convinced, I know, that there are lots and lots of places in the world where it isn't happening. And so one of the things we want to try and do is to produce some good case studies. I mean, let's find a place where it's working really well, whether it's Basingstoke or Jogjakarta, and actually tell the story. And then we can take that story in a 4-page briefing paper to Sierra Leone or Dar es Salaam and try and develop the thing there. And so we have this very particular proposal to try and go to ground level in somewhere. ASEAN would be one example. There were some others on the chart. But the other idea we have is to try and create a global network of people who are interested in this topic, and we'd like to sign you up as the first member, because I think there are stories to tell. And just like everything that ODI does, it's about translating research into practice and bridging research and policy. And it does seem to us that, you know, in a very modest way, it's great that the World Economic Forum is not only thinking about how to reform the banking system, it's also thinking about these humanitarian issues. And there is a level of willingness to do something. You can help us, I think, by helping to shape the conversation going forward, and we would absolutely welcome inputs.
Great. Well, I think that's a great note to finish on. Thank you all very much indeed. Particular thanks to Simon and Dan for a very stimulating session. Do, if you can, pick up a copy of the report. Have we got it to download from the... We will have it to download or from the event site, so you can also download it straight away. Thank you all very much for coming. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. How are you? I'm very well, Josie.